Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our Michigan Water and Wastewater Professionals Week webinar series. My name is Matt Tomlinson, and I'm with Eagle's Environmental Support Division, and I will be your host behind the scenes today. But before we kick it off with our speaker, I want to introduce you to our first webinar, and that's Drinking Water Webinar, the Safe Drinking Water Act Review. I want to remind all of our attendees that all lines are muted during the webinar. We are recording this webinar, and you will get a follow-up email that will have some additional links in it that we cover today and a link to this recording. You can interact with our presenter today, and you can do that by using the Q&A function located on your Zoom toolbar and submit that question, and we will address that at an appropriate break. Some of you are attending today's session to get continuing education credits, and just want to remind you that you must be logged in as yourself. You must attend the entire session, and you must answer the 3 poll questions. We're actually running a poll question right now, so you should have seen that when you logged into the system. And if you can select an answer there, that'll mark you down as taking the poll. We do get closeout reports, and we do review those at the conclusion of the webinar. We review the attendee report and the poll report, and then I will consolidate a CEC roster from there. And when that's completed, then I will send a copy of that to the appropriate water or wastewater certification program for their records. And so if you're in drinking water, you can expect to see your record updated within about 3 weeks. So with that, I am going to stop my housekeeping slides, and we are going to kick this off with a video from the Department of Environment and Great Lakes and Energy Director, Phil Roos.
Hi, I'm Phil Roos, Director of Michigan's Department of Environment, Great Lakes, and Energy. I invite you to celebrate Water and Wastewater Professional Week. This is an excellent opportunity to shine a well-deserved spotlight on a workforce that often works behind the scenes. These dedicated professionals are the unsung heroes who ensure we all have access to clean, safe drinking water and who protect the quality of our beautiful lakes and streams. So join us as we commemorate the outstanding work of Michigan's water and wastewater professionals. Follow us on social media and use the hashtag MyWaterProsWeek. Eagle is grateful for the dedication of these professionals, and we want to say thank you for everything you do.
All right, thank you, everybody. And this first, our presenter today is Amy Vale. Amy is a district supervisor in the Drinking Water and Environmental Health Division. So Amy, if you want to bring up your screen, we'll let you know what we see.
Yeah. And I don't know what happened outside my building. It just started doing some construction or something. So hopefully it does not come through on my mic.
All right, we see you in presentation mode. Take it away.
All right, thanks, Matt. I just want to turn my camera on real quick so people can put a name with the face if those of you who don't know me. I'm Amy Vale. I'm the district supervisor up here in the Cadillac District Office for Drinking Water and Environmental Health Division. Little bit about this presentation. A couple years ago, I was asked to put together a presentation on the Safe Drinking Water Act. And the reason why was we were seeing that on exams after math problems, most of the people are getting a lot of questions on the Safe Drinking Water Act incorrect. And so we saw a need to get out there and do a little bit of training on it. Another reason why I wanted to put this presentation together was before coming to, at the time, DEQ, I worked for a municipality for over a decade. And, you know, when you work for a municipality, you usually do things because you were taught by somebody else to do them. And so when I started working for DEQ and started having to read the Safe Drinking Water Act more, you know, in depth, a lot of things came to light, like, oh, that's why we did this, because it's in the Safe Drinking Water Act, or, oh, that's why, you know, they had us do that. Before I started working for the state, I used to complain. I'm like, how come they can't have common sense, when they're asking us to do certain things? And then as I started getting into the Safe Drinking Water Act, it was, oh, they're just enforcing the laws that were written, and they have to keep that going. They have to enforce those, even though sometimes it doesn't make sense to you as the one who's being regulated. So just kind of giving you a sense of, sometimes when Eagle asks you to do stuff, it's not because we want to be difficult or anything. It's because that's what's in the Safe Drinking Water Act. And we have to enforce that. A second here. So I just want to start off, and I'm not going to go super in depth of all the parts, but just I wanted to make you aware of what's in the different parts of the Safe Drinking Water Act, so that if you want to, when you have spare time and want to fall asleep, want to go back and review the Safe Drinking Water Act, you know where to go. It's a pretty easily searchable document, I found. And so, if you just look for keywords that you're looking for, you can usually find those in the Safe Drinking Water Act. So. All right, so we already did the first poll question, so that takes care of that. So the Safe Drinking Water Act has, several different things that we refer to it as. In 1974, the federal Safe Drinking Water Act came out, and we also thought it was a good idea to do this presentation because next year we're going to have the 50th anniversary of the Safe Drinking Water Act. And so, this is a good time to kind of go over it too. But you'll hear it referred to as the Michigan Safe Drinking Water Act, Public Act 399, 1976 Public Act 399, Public Act 399 as amended. They're all pretty much the same thing. So depending on what title we're using. If you want to look at a copy on our website, we do have a couple different, I guess we'll call them versions. So the one that says Safe Drinking Water Act 399, that is the administrative rules. That is the act itself. And then underneath that, we have Safe Drinking Water rules, supplying water to the public. That's our administrative code. So that's, I guess if you could say, a more user-friendly version of the Safe Drinking Water Act. This is what usually our staff refers to when we're doing sanitary surveys or when we're getting questions. We'll refer to this administrative code right here, and it just says because of the Safe Drinking Water Act, we can put these rules out there. And then also on our website, that's kind of handy, is we have links to some stuff that I'm going to talk about here in a minute, but like the 10 state standards, suggested practices, our cross connection manuals. So all of that's in the same spot if you ever are looking for them. So I'm just going to kind of go through the different parts, and each part right at the beginning tells like the purpose, like why is this in the rules? And then it has like any variations or like deviations that are accepted for those parts of the rules. And then it gets kind of into the meat and potatoes of what the part is. So part one is just called general provisions. It lays out all the definitions that are going to be in the Safe Drinking Water Act. So, I mean, it spells out like, what is a service line? What is a customer? What is, everything that's in the Safe Drinking Water Act. And some of those definitions do come into play. Like when we redid the lead and copper rule, we changed the definition of what a service line was. And so, when we're looking at stuff in the rules, we have to go by those definitions too. Then there's also a part in there that says adoption by reference or guideline information, because there's a lot of parts in the Safe Drinking Water Act that say like per the department or like per specifications, but it doesn't go into any detail. And so when it says that, these are the documents that we as the regulatory staff are using to look at those specifications. So it says, we look and use NSF standards, standard 60 and 61 for, water. We use 10 state standards, which is, what is that? Great Lakes, Upper Mississippi Basin, states. 10 state standards when we're reviewing permits and specifications that have been sent to us. It references AWWA standards and manuals so that we go by those when we're doing reviews. Suggested practices is something that is through the state of Michigan. When we were DEQ, it was created. That's because a lot of our rules are a little vague. And so we took the vagueness, some of those rules, and made suggested practices to kind of make them less vague. And I can give you some instances with that one. So, a suggested practice that it might say like, you must monitor, if you had chlorine, you must monitor for it. Well, we don't say how often and where, and so suggested practices will have that information in there. And then it also references our cross-connection manual. So we don't have an actual cross-connection rule, but there's a part in the Safe Drinking Water Act that talks about cross connections and refers to our manual. So even though all of these guidance and documents aren't in the Safe Drinking Water Act, the Safe Drinking Water Act says we will follow these because we've adopted them by reference. So part 4 is a part that talks about public notification and public education. The first thing it says that we'll give, if you get a violation or a variance or an exception, you have to let your customers know. You have to be transparent. And so it lists out all the things that you would have to public notice to your customers. So if you had a maximum contaminant level that you exceeded, you would have to let the customers know. If you went over the 4 parts per million for chlorine, so that's what the MRDL is. I don't know if anybody has that issue, but if you did, you would have to let your customers know. If you have treatment technique violations, such as maybe you didn't have an operator in charge for some time, that's a treatment technique violation. So you'd have to let your customers know. That if you did not take a sample or report it on time, you have to let the customers know. And I know this one is a little bit of a sticking point with some people. Say it was a lab error and they broke the bottle and you didn't have time to resample and we still give you the violation. And I know people get upset about that, but per the Safe Drinking Water Act, it says, doesn't matter whose fault it is, you have to let the customers know if you didn't either take the sample on time or report it on time, or have it fully compliant. And then there's some other situations it talks about with special notices. If you overfed chemicals, if you had fluoride greater than 2 milligrams per liter, because that can affect children, you also have to let your customers know. So you have to public notice for any of these situations. It also talks about the tiers of public notices. So the tiers are based on how serious a health effect is. We have tiers 1, 2, and 3. So tier 1 are those ones that are going to cause immediate public, health effects. So an E. coli MCL or a nitrate or nitrate MCL. Those ones have to be public notice within 24 hours. They're acute, meaning they can cause issues right away. And so you have to let your customers know as soon as possible. Tier 2 are the ones, they could cause health effects, but not immediate. So these are the more chronic ones. So if you had a treatment technique violation that could cause issues with public health, or any of the other MCLs, arsenic, metals, PFAS. So if you exceed any of those MCLs, you have 30 days to let your customers know. And then the tier 3 ones are the ones where you didn't do something, but it may or may not affect public health, the monitoring and reporting, where you reported something late to us on time, or the fluoride greater than 2 milligrams per liter. You have 365 days to get that public notice out. And I just want to make note that we have been giving more violations and fines for people not submitting public notices. Those tier 3s in the past kind of fell to the wayside, and just with staff time, it wasn't something they really, kind of followed up on a lot. But during EPA audits, we've been kind of dinged on that. So for the past, I think since May of, not this year, but last year, we've been giving violations and fines for not submitting those public notices to us. So make sure you get them in if you have to. Part 4 also talks about public education. So it has all of the things that you have to do if you have a lead and copper action limit exceedance. And so there's specific lead education that has to go out to your customers. And so it lays out what's in that public education, the timelines for when it has to be sent out to customers and everything. So if you have an action level exceedance, that's all spelled out in there. And it also talks about consumer confidence reports. Those are the reports that you have to send out once a year, and it has to list the detects that you've had in the system. There is specific language that has to be in it because of what's in the Safe Drinking Water Act. And if you go into this part 4, there is a really nice table in there that talks about all the contaminants and like uses the CCR units that you should be using. Should it be in parts per million or parts per billion? There's specific things that are laid out in those tables. It also talks about like sources of it and health effects. So all that required language that has to go in the CCRs is right in that table in part 4. All right. Part 5 talks about the types of water supplies. One thing to note, part 5 doesn't actually give the criteria. It just says you shall have a type 1 community, type 2 non-community, and type 3. And then our at the time DEQ policy and now Eagle policy sets those kind of limits. So the type 1 are the ones where we have a year-round population of at least 25 or more people or 15 or more service connections. Then we have type 2, the non-community, and that's broken up into 2A, which we call our non-transient, and 2B, which is transient. Non-transient are the people who are going to be there, you know, not full-time. They don't live there, but they're the same people are there often. So these are like dormitories at colleges and large employers in town. Those would be the non-transient because they are the same people coming. And then the type 2B is the transient. So those are where we have, 25 or more people and they're open for at least 60 days. Gas stations, restaurants, places where you're not going to have the same people there all the time. And the requirements for sampling and monitoring and other things are dependent on what type of water system you are. If you're going to have the same people living there year round, they're going to be more affected by the water. So you need to sample that more. If you have, people who are just coming to a gas station, they might not ever drink or consume the water, so they're going to have less stringent testing. And then type 3 is kind of our catch-all, so anybody who doesn't fit in any of these. So that might be like some duplexes where you don't have, a population of 25 or 15 service connections, but you have people living there year round. So they're classified as a type 3. All right. Part 5 also talks about some things that you have to have as a public water supply. We have this rule called Rule 503, which talks about like if you have 2 water systems that don't meet the definition of a type 1 or a type 2, but they are right next to each other and they're under the same ownership or the same operator, then we're going to consider that a type 1 water system. A lot of times some developers will be like, oh, well, if I put like 5 units over here and then I buy this next parcel and I put 5 units over here, well, then I don't have to follow the type 1 water system rules. Well, 503 says if together they are 25 or more people or 15 or more service connections, yes, you do. So can't skirt around the rules that way. It also gives some general requirements saying that if you are a type 1 or 2 water system, you have to have an operator in charge who does monitoring. You have to monitor for specific contaminants, that you have to submit reports and keep records. You have to, have a system to address cross connections and follow the plumbing code. And if you want to do any construction, you have to get a permit and submit specifications. That's all laid out in part 5. Part 6 kind of talks about the analytical techniques and standards. This is kind of like the rules part of the Safe Drinking Water Act. So here it lays out what the maximum contaminant levels are for all the different things that you monitor for. So if you don't know what something is, you can go in here and look it up. And then it's kind of got a lot of our rules. So the lead and copper rule, disinfection byproduct rule, for surface water systems, the long-term 2, enhanced treatment rule, and the groundwater rule. So all of those rules are kind of rolled into part 6. So if you have any questions about specifics of a rule, you'd go to part 6 and look at that. And then in the picture right here, it's got a nice little table in that one too. And it talks about like, if you have a violation of any of these, what is it? You know, is it a tier 1, tier 2, tier 3 violation, and all that kind of stuff. So it gives you all that information right in there in the table. Part 7 talks about the inspections, the monitoring, the surveillance that we have for water systems. Most of the total coliform rule is in a revised total coliform rule is in part 7. And then part 7 talks about sampling, analysis, and monitoring requirements. So if you are a brand new water system or you have brand new source, what are the initial requirements for monitoring? And when you do that, you know, what happens if you get a detect? What happens if you don't have a detect? You know, it talks about how you can reduce monitoring or increase monitoring depending on what you're sampling and when you're sampling. And it goes through all of the different things that you guys would sample for. So it talks each group individually. It talks about the organics have their own section, VOCs and SOCs, RADs, lead and copper, and so on. They are all spelled out in there in each one, because each one is different depending on, you know, if you have detects and how often you have to monitor for, and how to get, you know, if you're on reduced monitoring and then you go to increased monitoring, how do you get back to reduced monitoring? All of that is laid out in part 7. Part 7 also talks about having to use an approved laboratory for all of your monitoring. So if it's for compliance monitoring, that you have to use an approved laboratory. And it talks about the reporting to Eagle. So, you know, that usually it's 10 days after the monitoring period or when you get the results. So if you get them before the end of the monitoring period, because, you know, say you take your annual chems in July, we don't want you holding on to them till October 10th because it's the September 30th deadline. So you should be submitting them when you receive them and at the latest 10 days after the end of a monitoring period. And if it's anything that has to deal with waterborne diseases, within 24 hours. So those E. coli MCLs, nitrate MCLs. And it discusses sanitary surveys and on-site inspections that the state has the right to perform those and what should be done during those inspections. I just wanted to note that we do see some common compliance issues under Part 7. When we have the RTCR, the revised total coliform rule, a lot of systems are getting violations for not doing the correct follow-ups after any total coliform positives. So just remember, if you're a groundwater system, you should be doing the repeat of the spot where you had the positive, upstream and downstream locations that you have on your sample site plan. And if any wells were running within 72 hours, you have to go get those raw water samples also. And then another thing we see people not knowing is what triggers level 1 and level 2 assessments and the deadlines associated with those. So people will not complete those, or you know, not know what triggers them, because those are exam questions that could get asked. And then the groundwater rule, a common thing that we see that gets violations for is not taking the proper amount of well samples after a positive. The way the rule is written, it's kind of funky. So say you were supposed to collect 5 samples and 2 of your 5 came back positive. So you would have to go and collect 2 samples from each well that was running when those samples were taken. So even though it kind of seems like, well, that's stupid, I got to go and like take 1 sample and then 10 seconds later take another sample. Yeah, it does kind of seem stupid, but that's the way the rule's written right now. So until that gets changed, that is how the rule's written. So you do have to take 1 well sample for each positive that you had. Part 8 talks about groundwater sources. So it kind of spells out everything for wells. It talks about the locations where you should try and put wells, where you shouldn't put wells. Talks about isolation distances. So for type 1 water systems, you know, 200 feet from, most things 2,000 feet from major contamination. That you have to have a hydrogeologic study done when you want to put a well in to look at the geology and the water that you're trying to tap into. It discusses if you want to convert a test well to a production well, that you have to, ask the department has to give approval for that. So even though you do a test well and you get all the information, you can't just say, okay, that's good, I'm going to put it into production now. You have to get a separate permit to change it into a production well. Talks about all the requirements that should be there for the well, the casing, that it should be at least 12 inches above ground, that you should not have any buried suction lines, that it should be grouted. This is one where I was talking about like 10 state standards and suggested practices in AWWA. It just says it should be grouted in a manner as not to, I think it says like have contamination, but it doesn't say anything about like neat cement. So that's where we use our other resources to say, yes, it should be neat cement when you're grouting a well. Talks about the requirement to have vents on your well and different appurtenances. Everybody who's gotten a water level measuring device violation in the past couple of years, that's because of this part. It says it should have these appurtenances, and one of them is it should have a means by which to measure the water level. So that's why we give those violations, is because it's in the Safe Drinking Water Act, so we've got to cite it. The requirement for aquifer tests is in there. So doing, looking at the drawdown of the aquifer when the well is pumping. It talks about how after you do any type of construction or repair, you should do bacteriological sampling to make sure contamination didn't enter, and the need to properly plug abandoned wells. They're all covered in section 8. 9's a pretty short section. Surface water sources. It just says like, hey, if you want to put a surface water system there, you have to assess the proposed source. So to make sure there's no contamination, it's not down gradient of a wastewater treatment plant, effluent, or things like that. And then it says about the intakes that the intakes should be made of, approved materials and, submerged pretty much. So nothing can hit it. So pretty short section there. All right, you want to launch that next poll question?
Sure can. All right, sorry for the delay there. It should have just launched. And the question is, when should you submit your monitoring results to Eagle? And we're at about 91% of you answering, so we'll go just a couple more seconds, and then we'll end the poll. All right, ending the poll. And I will be sharing the results.
Yay! Yes, it's within 10 days after the monitoring period is the, the last date you can turn it in. Thank goodness nobody put the last one, but guess what? That happens all the time. So we're all set with that. All right. Part 10 is mainly for surface water systems or systems that do specific types of treatment. It talks about that you have to have enough water to have continuous flow to customers, even if you have units out of service. And so it talks about, rated capacity, firm capacity, of a system, that you have to be able to get water to your customers at a proper pressure. So, it's 35 PSI at a minimum, 20 PSI under like peak demand, such as during a fire. It talks about design and operation requirements. So say for a surface water system that, where should you put coagulants in? Where should you put disinfection in? That you shouldn't have a common wall between raw water and finished water in case there's a leak. So all of that spelled out there. And then same thing with pumping facilities, that you can get the water to the customers at a proper pressure. When there's high demands, do you have enough storage to take into account if you have a high demand? Do you have enough daily storage to meet the needs of your customers? So that's all in part 10. Part 11 talks about the distribution system and the storage tanks. So it's going to talk about water mains, that the water mains, again, can get the water to the customers and are properly sized, that they are made of approved materials. And again, this is one of those things. It says materials approved by the department, but it doesn't say anything else. That's where we come to our AWWA standards and our 10 state standards and our NSF standards. Those are the approved materials because they're adopted by reference. That you shouldn't put water mains in areas where there's high contamination. I know some, especially like in the Southeast, that's a difficult thing to do. There's, leaky gas stations everywhere. But, we have ways to mitigate if it's, in an area of contamination, like using different types of gaskets and, different types of materials. Talks about the need for having valves in your water mains, that if you put in new water mains, you're supposed to be pressure testing them. Discusses that you should be flushing and disinfecting the water mains before they go into service, and that you should keep records of like your flushing and your valve turning, so that you know what's going on in your system. And then it talks about storage tanks. It breaks it down into the different types of storage tanks. So the gravity tanks versus ground tanks and hydropneumatic tanks. Just the requirements for those, that they don't have openings to the environment, and that they have vents, and that you have those frost-free vents so they don't collapse your tank. And then if you're doing anything where you're like opening to the wetted surface, that you're disinfecting the tank before it's going back into surface. Part 12 deals with reliability. So it talks about the need for reliability studies. Those are supposed to be done every 5 years. And so that you're supposed to be looking at your system, looking at any growth in the system and saying, like, can we reliably get water to our customers now and in the future? And so that's what those reliability studies are. This again talks about rated capacity. So if your largest treatment unit or your largest well is out of service, can you still get water to the customers at the proper pressure? It talks about the fact that you have to have at least 2 wells because you need that redundancy, so that if one of your wells goes down, you have a backup well, so you aren't without water. And then it discusses interruption of service. So if you are a system that has 100 people, 100 units or 200 bed facilities, that you're supposed to have on-site generators. And that if you have, say, a water main break and you have interruption of service, that you should be disinfecting after that in case any contamination gets in. 13 talks about construction permits and specifications. It says that if you want to do construction that is not pretty much replacing like with like, you're changing the capacity of an area of the water system, you're changing materials, you're changing the size of a pump, you're changing a chemical, any kind of change that is not just a like for like swap. You're not replacing 10-inch ductile iron water main with 10-inch ductile iron water main. You should be getting a permit. Again, our permits are free, so it's not that difficult, and they're not expensive because they're free. It's a lot more costly if you don't submit a permit, because then you get fines and have to enter in an administrative consent order with the state. So just submit the permits. It talks about the fact that you should be submitting plans and specifications for review, and that those must meet those standards, AWWA, 10 states, NSF, that you should be submitting engineering reports and basis of design. So letting us know, why are you putting in, 10-inch water main versus 12-inch water main? What is the justification for what you're proposing? And then talks about the need to submit permits. So we have our permits out there, and that the department has to review and approve the specifications and design reports before issuing the permit. 14 talks about cross connections, and this area is a little bit vague, I'd say, and it doesn't cover a ton of stuff. And that's why we have our cross connection manual out there to assist with, implementing cross connection programs. Because all 14 says is pretty much you have to follow plumbing and residential codes. You should have a cross connection program. You should have backflow preventers tested by a qualified tester. And for the Safe Drinking Water Act, the qualified tester is somebody who is ASSE 5110 certified, so American Society of Sanitary Engineers. Recently, a letter went out to all the water systems about the requirement for a licensed plumber to also do those backflow preventer tests. That is through LARA. That is LARA's regulations of the Skilled Trade Act. Somebody had asked them to interpret, is backflow preventer testing considered plumbing work? And they got an AG opinion that said, yes, that's plumbing work. So they said, well, if you're doing plumbing work, you got to be a licensed plumber or be a journeyman under a licensed plumber. So that is why that requirement's there. It's not an EGLE requirement, it's a LARA requirement. But since the Safe Drinking Water Act says you have to have a qualified tester, that LARA requirement comes in. So that's kind of where that came from. And it also says that you have to be able to identify your piping and have them. Some things that are not covered in the Safe Drinking Water Act, but we do see a lot on exams, is the definitions, back pressure versus back siphonage. So make sure that you know the difference between the two of them. And none of the assemblies are covered in the Act. So if you're getting ready for exams, it would be good for you to know, what's the difference? Which one is kind of like the best of the best? Air gaps are number one up there, followed by the RPZs, and when would it be okay to have a certain device on high risk versus low risk. So if you are studying for the exams, just know that this isn't in the Safe Drinking Water Act, but it's good information to know. 15 talks about MORs, so the monthly operations reports and record keeping. It says if you treat, you should be submitting a monthly operations report, and it has what should be on there, how much you're pumping, what chemicals you're adding, what's the dosage, what are the residuals. So that's all laid out in there. And that MORs when they're due. And it's kind of confusing with MORs because the rule says 30 days after the end of the month. So, if you do June's data, July 30th, it's due. But that's only if there's no compliance information on the MOR. So that's just if you're just given pumpage, whatever how much chlorine you applied. A lot of people submit their bacteriological results with the chlorine residuals on their MORs. That is actual compliance data. So if you're submitting your MOR with the BACT and chlorine residual at the BACT site information, that's due by the 10th. If you're not submitting that, you submit that somewhere differently, a different lab report, then the MOR is not due to the 30th of the following month, or 30 days of the following month. It gets confusing because of that whole compliance information that most people submit on their MORs. So that's why you sometimes hear two different dates. It says that if you don't do an MOR, that you need to submit an annual pumpage report to the state. It talks about the other annual reports that are due, you know, the pumpage report, the cross connection inspection reports, that those are submitted annually. And if any other additional reports are required by the department, that you have to submit those. It also discusses records retention and how often or how long you should keep records. This is another really good exam question, because I see these on the exams all the time. So, you know, if it's back T and turbidity, 5 years, all chems except for lead and copper are 10 years, lead and copper is 12 years. Original records, 12 years, you know, survey items, 10 years after the survey. So public notice is 3 years. This is all spelled out in the Safe Drinking Water Act. So if staff are coming and doing an inspection and asking like, hey, can I see your back T from June of 2020, you know, you should have that on site. 16 talks about the requirement to have general plans. It says here's what should be in a general plan. So the layout of the system, including, you know, treatment, your valves, your hydrants, your tanks, all that stuff should be on that general plan so that you know where everything is. Again, there's a lot of different parts that talk about rated capacity. So just, can you get the water to your customers at the pressure that is in the Safe Drinking Water Act? So you have that. And the distribution system inventory, so the verification of service lines. So now with the lead and copper rule revisions, that you should be verifying your service lines and have that as part of your inventory too. So not just the mains and the tanks, but have a list of the service lines and what they're made up of. Talks about that you have to submit an update if you are asked for it within 6 months. So a lot of times what'll happen is we go out on a sanitary survey, you know, you've done some construction, you've done a lot of like water main replacements. We might ask for an updated general plan, and you have 6 months to get that to us without a violation occurring or deficiency. So. And then if you have fire protection, there is a part in there that talks about the need to do a hydraulic analysis. So you can see what the pressures are under peak demand, so they're not dropping under that 20 PSI. And that you should have an inventory of your mains and your service areas on maps if you're doing fire protection. 16 also talks about the need to have an asset management plan or a capital improvements plan. So any water system that is over 1,000 residents, this is a requirement for them, but it's still a good idea if you don't have 1,000 residents, because this is your planning document that kind of is your roadmap for your water system. It says, here's what we have. Here's, here's what we want in the future. Here's what we need. And do we have the money to pay for that? And if we don't, you need to start looking at, can we accomplish what we need? Can we meet just our basic levels of service that we have out there? Or do we need to start raising rates to maintain the system, raising rates to improve the system? The asset management plan is your ticket to start asking for money and stuff, because you can show these are our needs and this is how we need to get there. So that's my little asset management spiel. Don't just do it because we said it was a requirement and put it on a shelf. But in the asset management plan, you should have how are you maintaining your inventory? How are you getting that information? You're supposed to talk about criticality. So if this asset fails, how critical is that to our water system? If it's a 6-inch main that's going out to a dead end of town, if it ruptures, oh well. If it is your main line that is bringing in water from the system that you're purchasing it from, and that fails, yeah, that's a big deal. So some assets are more critical than others. The level of service goals, what do we as a water system want to put out there? Do we want to have 1 part per million of chlorine? Do we want to maintain a pressure of so much in the water system? That's you as a water system. What do you want? Then you have to have capital improvement plans for 5 and 20-year periods. Summary of your funding and your rate methodology. Oh, we just haven't changed rates for 20 years because that's what our council likes and they like to get reelected. That's not going to do you any good. So that should all be taken into account with the asset management plan. 17 talks about private ownerships of public water systems. So, some of the condo associations or apartment complexes where it's not a municipality owning it, it talks that, they still have the same responsibilities, even though they're privately owned. And I don't know how many know this, but the local unit of government, whether it's the township, the county, what have you, actually has the first right to take over that water system, those private water systems. 99.999% of the time, they want nothing to do with them. So there's actually a document that has to be signed and notarized between the privately owned system and the local unit of government that says, we refuse the right to accept ownership of this private system. You can have it, you run with it. There's also a part in there that talks about that you have to set up an escrow fund when you start a new one or you transfer ownership, and amounts that have to be in there. So that's all laid out in there. And it talks about that you have to do the same things that a publicly owned water system does. You have to have easements for your isolation area and where your water system is. You have to be in control of where your water system is. You have to follow the same well abandonment things. You still have to have an operator in charge, that you're supposed to contact Eagle before you transfer ownership. A lot of times we find out when we go out on a survey, like, oh no, now this company bought this mobile home park or what have you. So they're supposed to get prior approval, just so that we can have conversations with the new owner about the responsibilities of owning a public water system, because a lot of times they don't know what they're getting into. So 19 is all about cert and the exams and certification. 19 lays out the classifications. So what makes one system an F4 versus a D2 versus an S3? That's all laid out. So, D and F are limited and complete treatment. Those are classified by either population or firm capacity, so the capacity of their treatment. And then the distribution systems are those S systems, and they are only by population. So it lays out all the requirements for why you are classified the way you are. Talks about the certification, the operators have to be certified, gives requirements for the exams, what we have to do as far as the exams go. The advisory board, which approves all the CECs, talks about the requirements for those. If you came from another state, it discusses reciprocity and how you can get a state of Michigan license that kind of goes along with what you had from another state. If you are suspended, it tells how you can get reinstated, but it also tells what operators can do to get their license suspended or revoked. And unfortunately, in the past couple of years, we've been seeing more and more of those suspensions and revocations for things like falsifying documents, just not being a good operator in any way, just not doing anything that they were supposed to do as part of their job. So, the things are laid out in there as to how that can happen. All right, 21 talks about chemicals. So if you are adding any chemicals for treatment, it says that the state has to approve those chemicals before you start using them. It talks about the criteria, and the criteria is pretty much make sure that the chemical you're using on its own or in combination with other chemicals is not going to cause harm to public health. So make sure that you're using stuff that isn't going to harm public health if used in the proper way. And if you're going to change a product, you should be notifying the department too. Things like if you're adding phosphate for iron sequestration or corrosion control, there's different blends of those phosphates. And so if you change it without doing some type of study or notifying the department where we can look at it, sometimes that can change what the chemical you're using for treatment is. So, you might be doing like an 85-15 ortho blend. So it's almost all ortho. And if you change it to something that's less ortho, and you're using it for corrosion control, that could cause issues. So make sure if you're changing stuff, you're letting the department know. And we may or may not ask for a permit depending on what the change is going to be. And then the last section, it talks about emergency response plans. It lays out everything that should be in an emergency response plan. So the contents of it, having a list of emergency personnel, having an inventory of PPE and first aid, what procedures do you have in place to mitigate an emergency in like a timely manner? And yeah, most people, the emergency response plans we see, you use our template, which has all those content areas. But just make sure it's getting updated frequently because those contexts change. During an emergency is not the time to go, oh yeah, we should have updated this like 5 years ago because nobody's phone numbers are the same and that person's no longer here. And so make sure those are getting updated. And it also talks about procedures during an emergency that you're supposed to notify the department by phone or email or what have you. And after the emergency, you are supposed to submit a written report about the emergency within 90 days. So that written report should talk about what the emergency was, kind of like when and how was it found out, what did you do to mitigate and take care of the emergency, and kind of lessons learned, in the future, what could we do to not have this emergency happen? So you're supposed to be submitting a written report within 90 days of that emergency happening. Don't always see that, but it's in the rules. So with that, I'm at the end. So if we want to do that last poll question and then do any Q&A that we might have.
All right, great presentation, Amy. Thank you. Yeah, Ryan's going to bring up the final poll questions, so we'll let that run in the background. And I am just grabbing some links to put into the chat. So you should see a link in there for how to renew your drinking water certification. And then I just included the link for the Eagle Director. If you want to share that video with your counterparts, you are welcome to do so. We will be, looks like maybe Ryan dropped off. So may have had a little bit of an error there. So let me bring up the poll question. And I believe
too much drinking water stuff for him. He's like, I can't take it anymore.
All right, so we're going to launch this poll question. You should see that popped on your screen right now. Submitting a written emergency report. When you should do that. We'll let that run for a little bit. Again, you're going to get, we got some questions in the hopper here. So all right, the poll is up and running. You should see that on your screen right now. So please make a selection and we'll share the results in a moment. So I've got a question here, Amy. It says for surface water systems, is there a good reference for wells? My students often struggle on well-related questions.
We do have the well. Let me pull that up. Where I showed you the where the standard, the suggested practices, and there is a well. Is that not coming up? There's a well construction manual and there's the disinfection manual on our website. My website's not looking right here. So those are two good ones. Wateroperator.org has a well, like a little well course that's right on their website. Let me pull that up. I've gone through that and I think that one's really good. Just gonna try and pull it up real quick.
All right, looks like we're up to about 95% response into the final poll for those of you that have stuck around for the conclusion of this webinar. And so once Amy goes through her slide there, then we will share the results.
Yeah, so wateroperator.org has this free class, groundwater and get the pull and well care. This is a really good one. So you can just go on there and it's, you know, kind of on your own time. You don't have to sign up for specific days. I recommend this for my new staff when they come in. So I would say that was a good one. And then some of the stuff that we have on our website.
Great. Thank you, Amy.
Mhm.
All right. I'm going to end the poll here and share the results. And looks like the majority have selected 30 days after the emergency.
This is what happens when you ask a question after the last slide on a Safe Drinking Water Act presentation. Everybody's checked out. It's actually 90 days after the emergency is in the rule. So,
All right, great. Thank you for sharing
but
that.
if you want to submit it 30 days, that's even better. So.
All right, looks like we've had some more questions pop into the hopper. Can you share this presentation with us? And so, like I was starting to say, we will be doing a follow-up email that'll have some of the links in there that we covered today. And we will also include a copy of the presentation so you can review that at your own leisure. And you will also get a copy of the recording, and you can review that as well. All right. Looks like we had a couple of those questions on the presentation and the webinar, so I think those are covered.
And I just put that wateroperator.org website in there. So if anybody wants to check out that groundwater and well course.
Okay, and we can include that in the follow-up email as well. Let's see. Here's a question that says, I'm currently searching for CEC. No, I don't think that one is CEC for my S license that I currently have. Do you have any suggestions? So I think I can answer that one. CECs for drinking water courses. We are very close to sharing the drinking water 2024 operator certification calendar. You can find that updated out on the operator certification website for drinking water. And again, we'll put that in the follow-up email. We just got that posted, so we haven't marketed it yet. We're still actively turning on courses that are going to be taking place in the first half of 2024. So that will continue to be enhanced, and we will be sharing that with you.
Yeah. And on that operator certification website too, there is a list of approved online courses. So if it's getting down to the time and you can't make it to one of ours, there is a slew of online courses that are approved for like 0.1 CECs. So that's on the OpCert website too.
Yeah, absolutely. We've got quite the variety out there. So you guys will be able to take advantage of that soon. CECs, when will they get recorded for this webinar? So part of the closeout steps for this webinar session and the ones that are happening during the remainder of the week will be reviewing the attendee report to make sure that you were here for the duration of the webinar, and then to review the poll question response report. And I know I do have some comments in here for some people that were having a little bit of trouble responding to the poll question, but I basically merged those reports together. And then I will send a final CEC report to the Drinking Water Operator Certification Program for this session. And they generally will be able to get that updated within about 3 weeks. So please give them a little bit of time. We are going into the holiday season. So I would expect beginning of January, you'd be able to see the updates from attending these webinars on your record. All right. I think that covers the bulk of our questions.
All right.
And again, I want to thank you, Amy, for putting on this session. A lot of material, great information. And to our attendees, we hope to see you tomorrow morning at 10 a.m. for the next webinar. We are starting these webinars a few minutes early to let you get into the session so that we can start promptly at 10 a.m. So I encourage you to log in a little bit early to make sure your webinar functionality is working. So again, thank you for participating in today's webinar and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks, everybody.